People can do really hard, horrible things if they have purpose. I live life largely in this wheelchair, but what I've seen is that hope is a living force. Hope feeds hope, feeds hope, feeds hope. I think we all get to be living survival guides for each other, that we get to go back to the worst moment we've ever had and look somebody in the eye and say, you're coming out too.
Our guest today is world-renowned speaker Katherine Wolf.
Katherine Wolf.
Katherine Wolf.
Author of 3 best-selling books and prominent personality across social media. Katherine Wolf.
I was 26 years old and out of absolutely nowhere, with no medical history, no family history, I had a massive brainstem stroke and very nearly died. Everything has both good and hard in it, I believe. So much of the deep sadness we feel in life is because we had different expectations for how it was going to be. And yet, what if we don't? What if we live knowing things are good and hard at the very same time?
It was Jay, your husband, who wrote, "Trying to find anything good in our stories of trauma and loss can feel like searching for a goodness needle in a hell haystack." What do you do in those moments when you're searching in a hell haystack?
Today we have a very special episode of the Mighty Pursuit podcast. We traveled down to Atlanta for a sit-down conversation with Katherine Wolf. Back in 2008, Katherine was working as a model and actress in Hollywood and had just given birth to her first baby. One afternoon, she was in her living room and she suffered a catastrophic stroke caused by a congenital brain defect she never knew she had. After a 16-hour brain surgery, 40 days in the ICU, a year in neuro rehab, and 11 operations, she miraculously survived and continues her recovery to this day. Despite all the challenges she has faced, Katherine is one of the leading advocates for hope. In the years that have followed, Katherine has become a world-renowned speaker and author. She has nearly 250,000 followers on Instagram and has spoken to crowds as large as 65,000 people. The memoir she wrote with her husband Jay, Hope Heals, has sold over 100,000 copies. In today's conversation, we not only explore how to walk through suffering, but how to thrive in the midst of it. As you'll learn, life can be simultaneously good and hard at the same time. Hope is possible for all of us, no matter what we go through. So without further ado, Katherine Wolf.
So I kind of want to start with a specific date, April 21st, 2008. So can you tell me what happened that day?
Absolutely. I was 26 years old and had married and had a baby 6 months before. And out of absolutely nowhere, with no medical history, no family history, no symptoms, nothing, I had a massive brainstem stroke and very nearly died. I had a birth defect called an AVM, arterial venous malformation, that was in my brainstem and caused the stroke. That then a brave surgeon would spend 16 hours operating on my brain to keep me alive. And which he did, I'm here. However, in that surgery, many sacrifices had to be made to keep me alive. And you're seeing a very much here miracle version of me, but also you're seeing, a lot of deficits that had to be done to sustain life.
What disabilities did it immediately cause for you?
Right out of the gate, I was essentially taken back down to nearly a baby. I had to relearn absolutely everything, from walking to using a hand that doesn't have fine motor control, to not eating for a full year, being on a tube fed through my stomach, everything, really. And while many of those things got much better and are much better today, almost nothing has completely returned, which is so fascinating. After April 21st, 2008, my health really turned. My body became quite different.
I love the way that you and your husband Jay wrote the book, Hope Heals, because it was like you were filling in the gaps for each other. And
Well, we were.
yeah. And so I mean, I got his perspective in that time that was following, because you were incapacitated, but so you were in a state of like semi-consciousness for 2.5 months.
Yes. It's semi-consciousness. I have no memory for the first 2.5 months after the stroke. So for me, it was like, everything's great. I'm in our apartment. And then I wake up from, what I feel like has been a night in the hospital. I'm not sure why, and have no idea that it's actually been 2.5 months, and that I nearly died and was on life support for 40 days, and that my babies had to be raised by other people for this time. And I was breastfeeding, and that baby had to be put on formula and cared for by others for months. It was really, really horrible.
Do you remember the first time you were like aware?
I do. What's so funny is my family and friends thought it was much sooner than I have memory of, because I was seemed like I was tracking with them. But I have no memory for weeks after they feel like I was conscious. And the brain is crazy like that. But even once I was, I still could not communicate. So I would use a communication device called a letterboard, where I would punch letters. The letterboard would then say out loud the letter, and my family could spell the word. So I would type early on, and I would type obsessively, I'm the same on the inside. I'm the same on the inside, because I wanted my family to know that I was still in here, that everything was still intact. My personality, my memories, it's all here. It's just, I can't get a sound out. I can't do anything.
Do you remember the emotion that you felt when you first became aware?
Many complicated emotions, but mostly probably a fear of what is this? Why can't I do anything? And also just the deepest of deep frustrations that I was so helpless. Also probably some anger of get me out of here. This is nuts. Yeah, a lot of various emotions actually. And also a sense of what happened? I mean, I had no idea what could have happened. And that was just haunting in my brain, to just be wrestling constantly with, was I on a motorcycle and fell off? Could that be why I'm here? What, I just couldn't understand. And it was just a very traumatic time. You're just so caught between life and death, truly. You can't even speak, you can't walk, you can't sit up, nothing. And so you're just alone with your thoughts, and it was horrifying.
Yeah, you use that term a lot in your books, like caught between life and death, and kind of like neither side wanted you.
Well, exactly. Which is kind of the ultimate, a deep sadness to feel like, I don't fit anywhere. And, our friends, including myself with profound disabilities on the outside, know that feeling, actually. So it's been this weird camaraderie with people living with disabilities, that we don't fit anywhere. We don't really fit in this world. It's not made for us. Nothing's fully accessible unless you happen to be at a coffee shop that is.
There was this line that you wrote in Hope Heals about, I guess this was right after you became conscious, but you said, I tried to call out to Jay, who was sitting in the corner, but my voice wouldn't make any noise. And it, one of my deepest fears is like, what would it be like to get like ALS? For example, like end stage ALS, where like your body doesn't work, but then you also can't speak. And when I thought about you in that state, it seemed so similar to me of someone that couldn't use their body, couldn't speak, and you're just like lying there. And so like, how did you process that?
I'm not even sure that I could process it in real time. Probably has taken many years to unpack the trauma that was that feeling, that ALS-like feeling of being so trapped inside of oneself. And I don't know. I think I was able. It was so awful that I had no choices. So it's easy for me to say this in some ways. In some ways, it's the opposite of that. It was so bad and so shocking and traumatic and horrifying that I had nothing to do but just be in it. I don't know how to describe that exactly, but it's like I'm living minute by minute in this nightmare, and yet I'm just going to kind of go to a place of deep contentment and peace because there was no other option. There's nowhere to hide.
You wrote in Hope Heals that like every night for a period at least that like you used to cry yourself to sleep.
Yeah.
And so when you're in that state of mind, feeling hopeless, like what made you go on?
A lot of things. One for sure was there are no other options, honestly. And that's like the least inspiring thing I could say, but it's the truth. When things are so bad, you don't have a lot of choices of how you're going to respond to things. You just kind of have to go on. I like to say when you're going through hell, keep going. That's my big advice. You might as well just keep moving forward. It can't get any worse. And that's the truth. But also, I knew that there was so much more at work here, that this story wasn't just about me, that this is a beautiful somehow story. It's a messed up story, 100%. And yes, it's a beautiful story at the same time. And this complex story that is my life was and does have really very difficult parts. And yet it's somehow this long chapter book. It's not just one little momentary story. And that thought, that thinking that is influenced 100% by my faith sustained me. I knew like this is not always going to be how it is.
You lost so many of your basic functions that so many of us take for granted, and like you're working as an actress and a model in Hollywood, and just got married, had a baby, and your story kind of shows the suddenness of life.
Right.
That it could just change, and then you're just lying there. And so I think that you're lying there in the hospital bed. And so I think when things like this happen, like at least at some point, if not immediately, it causes you to zoom out, and people start getting existential about like life, of like, why is this happening to me? Why, this is not the way that I thought life would turn out. And obviously, some people listening right now might believe in God, and other people don't.
Yeah.
And there's like a couple different ways that this could go, I guess, when you're in a situation like this, which is like some people would say this is evidence that there's nothing
Mm-hmm.
beyond this world or God or whatever, because they can't fathom how like a loving God would allow this thing
Right.
to happen.
Yeah.
And obviously you've had years and years and years of processing, but it seemed like those existential questions, at least in the beginning, haunted you a little bit. Is that true?
Absolutely, they did. Before I answer that, what I have to say is 16 years later, I wonder if there's still the evidence there is no God. I think that's worth thinking about. Like me being here, having a thriving life, does beg the question: what evidence is this today? But early on, there was this deep, haunting question of, did God make a mistake leaving me on earth? Like, should I have died? If God is even real, is he here? And it was almost a feeling of, this has to be a mistake, because this couldn't happen and be part of a good story. And it was crazy, because even in that, it's like I know too much to know that that isn't true. That I knew deep inside of me that whatever state my body is in, I am worthy of a flourishing life. And I'm going to need to recover some basic function to execute that flourishing life. But I'll get there. And somehow, if I was not supposed to be here, I would not be here. So logically, if I'm on earth, there is purpose. That I woke up from the surgery, and if I wasn't supposed to be here, I wouldn't have woken up. So I might as well get busy living. And I did.
Yeah, I think when you go through hard things and suffering, it's not automatic that you would have that perspective, in the sense that, like, there's only really two ways it could go. Like, it either refines you and you embody a perspective that you now, which we're going to get into, and everything that's happened in the past 16 years, and it builds your character and all these other things, or it could just destroy you and tear you down. And so what do you think the difference is there, in terms of someone being completely broken by, they lost a child, or something has happened in their life and they just can't get past it, they can't move on, and it cripples them, versus you have a whole organization now called Hope Heals. So,
Right, yep. So, I've heard it said before that you never move on. That's not a thing. No one moves on. You can move forward, but moving on is ludicrous. Like, who moves on when they lose a child? That's a joke. But we can learn the right lessons from the deep loss and count it as tools in our backpack to go forward in this messed up world, honestly. I think we have the opportunity to, what I like to call, finding the treasure, that in our deep darkness, I read a book about it, that you find the treasure in the dark and you cling to it. You hold tight to what you get in the darkness, so that when you aren't there anymore, you have it to let it inform the way you live the rest of your life. And that's a profound thought. I listened to a podcast recently, where the guy on the podcast, what did he say? It was so good. He said, it's not about letting go. That's not a thing. You don't just let go of deep, horrible, traumatic suffering. What you do is you let in. You let it in. You let all the sadness, the sorrow in. You grieve deeply. You lament the hell you've been through. and you process it and you let it break your heart. This is Katherine Wolf talking now. You let it break your heart because it should. It merits brokenness and sadness. And when you have appropriately grieved and processed, you can, in fact, move forward.
Yeah, it was Jay, your husband, who wrote in Suffer Strong, which was your second book. Trying to find anything good in our stories of trauma and loss can feel like searching for a goodness needle in a hell haystack.
Yeah.
And when I read that line, I was just like that. It's just so true.
Yeah.
And so you certainly could have been in that place of like seeing every single thing that in this hell haystack. Like, so what do you do in those moments when you're searching in a hell haystack?
Yeah.
For goodness.
For the goodness needle. I love that too. I would say when things are awful in your story, which we all go through awful things, there is opportunity to see things differently, to flip the script a bit, to choose, like, I'm going to just look at this situation a little differently. For instance, I live life largely in this wheelchair. And that could feel incredibly just confining to me, constraining. And yet, I've kind of flipped the script a bit. I've wrapped my mind and processed it that actually this wheelchair gets me to where I want to go, to do what I want to do. This wheelchair is helping me my life. This wheelchair is getting me into the rooms I want to be in. And I get to decide how I feel about it. And that is true with everything in our lives. We have choices about how we feel about everything. Everyone feels so powerless, like, I'm just going to have to respond. No, you don't. You can be proactive. And no, I get to look at that reality and see it as reality and not some pie in the sky thing. Recognize what is, but then decide how you feel about it based on what you know to be true, what you believe.
I think the struggle, I even think about someone who's, I don't know, I think there's so much emphasis on our emotions, especially for people that trend younger millennials.
Yes, totally.
I mean, even myself, just Generation Z. And so, what do you do with your emotions? Because what you're talking about is perspective. You're talking about a decision that you're making apart from your emotions, in a sense.
Yes. Yes.
And so, how do you kind of avoid letting your emotions just drag you down in a moment, and when it doesn't align with that value or higher truth that you're aspiring to?
Absolutely. Emotions can't rule the show, or you can never live out what you want to in your life. To put it in a way that's very basic, like, if you're chasing what the emotions are telling you, you're getting nowhere. You're a slave to your emotions. Like, why not? I don't know. I think maybe the key is to never suppress emotion, because, like, I'm a big believer in therapy. I love my therapist to the moon and back. And I don't think we should ever suppress the feelings inside of us. But if we are elevating emotions as the most important thing in our stories, then we're constantly changing how we feel about everything. Nothing is real. Like, I think we're called not to suppress and not elevate in the very same breath, to hold them well and let them inform us how we live, because our emotions are telling us what's going on. But if we let them rule the show, I think there's such a sadness in living that way.
Would you say that in your story, so let's just, you wake up from a state of semi-consciousness, there's fear, there's pain, there's all these emotions that are happening.
Yes.
And so at some level, you want to be able to arrive to a place of, because peace is an emotion, sort of, or it's kind of a state of being, I guess.
Yeah.
And so is there a dynamic that happens when like you don't succumb to your emotion in the moment, and then something happens to you internally later on, when you're pursuing something higher, when you're pursuing the perspective that you're talking about?
I think so. Yeah. I would say even in the early months of the ordeal, once I regained consciousness, once I started to relearn to eat, speak, walk, etc., there was like this crazy hope happening. There was this sense of like, wow, this is a big like new direction my life is taking, and I hate it here. This is horrible. And yet in the same breath there was this sense of like, this is this crazy story and I want to live it so well. I want to live my story well. I've only got one life and I very nearly died. So this is my second chance life here. I want to live this really well. And if this is the only body I've got, let's do it. And it was very inspiring of myself. Is that a thing? I don't know, but it got me up in the morning for another full day of terrible therapies and, practicing moving a marble with my hand that doesn't work and relearning to walk and just becoming a functioning human being again.
It's almost like you're talking about the importance of meaning in the midst of what you're going. Is that right? It's like makes or break the entire thing.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. People can do really hard, horrible things if they have purpose. And I believe if they have hope, that because I have hope, I'm willing to put in the hours in physical therapy. And hope is such a elusive, complicated thing for people to understand. But for me, hope has not been a fixed point that I'll reach. Because here, 16 years in, I've had a lot of really horrible stuff happen. I'm sure we'll get to that, but it hasn't exactly been all coming up roses since the stroke. It's been quite the opposite of a lot of hard stuff. But what I've seen is that hope is a living force. Hope feeds hope, feeds hope, feeds hope. And when you've got this hope, it propels you forward into the ongoing hurt of this world with an ongoing hope that you can do this. And you go back in and there's no quota on suffering, and you go in again and again, but you're differently resilient because of the hope that you got last time.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one word to describe you, I would say inspiring. I think there was this powerful story in your book, and this was like very early on, like probably 4 or 5 months after the incident. And so I think at this point, like you can't walk, you can't eat, like you have a tube for food and stuff like that.
For sure, yeah.
And so you wrote about how it took 3 therapists to help you hobble around. And at that point, you told the nurses, I should never get to do this. I almost died. Tell your patients anything is possible. Never give up hope. And then you talked about how this made them cry. And I was just like, wow, like that. This is like very early on that you had this mindset.
I don't think anybody has ever asked me about this before, but I'm so glad you are. It's such a good, important thought that what was so cool about that was, so those 3 therapists helping me walk around the hospital, we went to a different part of the hospital, and the nurses were not familiar, obviously, with me or my story in that part of the hospital. So I was kind of educating them and really wanting to just encourage the people to keep going. And as much as I wanted them to fill their patients with hope, I wanted to fill their hearts with hope. That look how cool it is to see miracles right in front of you, and you get to be a part of it. And I think that has been the superpower at work in my story across the board, is for some reason, I have a very deep empathetic side to me. And I long for others to feel the hope and the comfort that I feel. And even weeks into relearning to walk, that just bubbled up and came out. That you get to be the ones to go and tell somebody else they can live this life. And I think that is all of our opportunity. I think we all in our lives get to be living survival guides for each other, that we get to go back to the worst moment we've ever had and look somebody in the eye and say, you're coming out too. You can do your life. You can live on the other side. We are sitting right now in our coffee shop employing people with disabilities here in Atlanta. And we have this beautiful model where we have customers who are also living with disabilities and wheelchair users frequent this space. And the other day on a field trip from a rehab center, a group of new wheelchair users came up to mend. And I got to put our book in their hands and look them in the eye and say, this is 16 years later. I was exactly where you are. And you're at my coffee shop. And you're coming out too. And that's what we get to do. We get to comfort others with the comfort that we've received. It is so powerful. You know, they say that when you are telling your story, any part of your story, to an empathetic listener, that it changes how you feel about your story. Neuroscience teaches that new neuro pathways are created when we are telling our story. Someone is receiving our story, actively receiving it. An empathetic listening presence, which I do a lot of these days, and it's really working powerfully, is changing how you feel about your story. I've bought so hard into that idea that I have what I lovingly call the Suffering Club, where I gather a group of women in my home every other week, and we sit with the hard stories. We've all got some hard stories, and we sit there and we listen. And we don't make it okay. We tie no bows on the end of it. We say no cliches. We simply sit and make awkward amounts of eye contact and listen. And if they need to tell their story 100 times, we will listen 100 times to every nightmare. And basically what we are saying with our bodies is we are not leaving the room. No matter how bad it gets, we are with you, and we are here, and we are listening, actively listening to your story, to your truth of what is happening in your life. There is, I won't go into it, but a woman whose husband, never mind, it's too sad to start sobbing, but just really hard stories of suffering. And
If you want to share, you can.
what now?
If you want to share it, you can.
Oh, okay. Well, Sure. In that club, there is a woman going through a horrible divorce. There is a woman who has a diagnosis of a terrible disease that's not present yet, so it's looming, and she knows it's coming, and it will be in the family of ALS when it hits. And we have a mother who's married 2 children, another mother who has 2 daughters who are slowly becoming very disabled due to a progressive neurological condition. And it's just this club of women that no one would ever in their right mind want to be in. Who wants to join the suffering club? But we are in it for life. It's electrifying. Suffering is this fascinating, binder, because all the stupid stuff doesn't matter anymore. You don't care what school is your kid going to go to when they graduate? Yeah, right. No one's asking that. No one cares. They're like, is your kid going to live to be 19 years old? That's the question. And suffering is so clarifying because you're like, we're here and we're rebelling against the deep darkness together. And it's just so powerful. I highly recommend it.
You talked a lot about the importance of community in your books. And
Yeah.
I think the hesitation for some people is moving closer to the pain,
Yeah.
about what that's going to do to them. And it's it's a little bit of a self-protective thing. It's almost in some way selfish of just you don't want someone else's pain to cripple you. And so you've taken the exact opposite approach. You're not only going through all this stuff yourself, but then you're moving towards other people and their pain. And so
I would say it's been my coping mechanism.
Yeah.
And it's extremely effective.
yeah.
I love that you're pointing that out. So many times when we're suffering, we can't possibly take on, handle, enter into the suffering of other people. It's like, I got enough here. My plate is quite full with hell. And yet, if we do just go outward with the pain, it changes everything. It gives you this perspective. It gives you a reason to get out of bed in the morning besides yourself. It gets you out of your head. It is so powerful.
You had a lot of lessons about how to interact with people who are hurting or grieving. And
Oh, yeah.
you've been vocal about how sometimes well-meaning people often made things worse for you.
Yeah, say the worst things, totally.
And so can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, for sure. So many well-meaning people just say the most stupid things, at least you had a baby before you had a stroke. This was before I had my second child, so imagine how devastating to hear that. Oh, so I guess you think now I'll never have more children? That was a big common one. And spoiler alert, I did have a second child. So all those people, yeah. So many people, both in faith context and not, just almost don't know where to look. It's just so hard and horrible. And so many times people want to share some dumb platitude to make it okay, really for them. It's for them to make it okay. So I don't feel as bad to know you're going through this horrible thing. And
which is kind of the self-protective thing that we were just talking about.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's so toxic. Stop doing that. Stop saying things to make yourself feel better when someone else is hurting. It's so terrible. What is amazing, I think, is to be real and let it sit. The most comforting words spoken to me post-stroke are the people who have said, I cannot believe this happens to you. Because that's what my soul was saying. That's what my heart was saying. Like, yeah, I cannot believe this happened. Thank you for acknowledging that rather than telling me how whatever it is. Everything happens for a reason. I don't need to know that in this moment. I need you to cry with me. I think there's so much to be said for just showing up and being present for the pain of other people. We don't need words. I like to say less words are the best words. Just shut up and be there. Let somebody cry with you. They're not doing well. And nothing you are going to say can make it better.
Yeah. What do you think of that phrase? Everything happens for a reason.
Oh, it's super complicated. I ultimately believe that everything does happen for a reason. I really do. And yet, I do not understand the reasons that things happen fully. I don't think anyone ever will. And yet, I'm okay with that. It's so interesting. I've thought so much about the what ifs of life. What if I would have had an MRI before I was 26 and they would have seen this mass on my brain? What if I would have done this? And it's this loop, this what if loop. But I just see this loop that we're all on, this what if game that we play. What if this? What if that? What if this? And there's this escape hatch in the what if loop. And it is hope. It is always hope that I have permission to live my actual life. And that is the great escape off of this loop. Like, no, the question actually isn't what if. The question to ask my heart and everybody's heart listening to this is what is? What is in the story? It doesn't really matter how you got here. You are where you are. Wake up. Start living right there. It is the most non-sexy advice ever. Like, be where you are. You have no alternatives. Like, what if is the dumbest game you could ever play? Because it's not. What if is not what happened?
Yeah, when I think about like your story, and I share this with hesitation because it's truly not about the numbers, but like the amount of people that you've impacted with your story is just insane. Like your Hope Heals book sold over 100,000 copies. Like all of this stuff has happened, and none of that. I don't know. I won't say none, but I don't know what would have happened with your story if there's a different version of all of that stuff. And I think that like people look at that and are so inspired by what's possible. But then, yeah, I mean, you said you had a 5-year period of just kind of obscurity.
Yeah.
And so how did that progress? Like you became an author, you're speaking in front of 65,000 people, like just starting this whole nonprofit that you've started. You have this coffee shop that serves the disability communities, but
we have a camp for families with disabilities that's amazing that you should come live podcast from this summer in Northwest Alabama. It's life-changing. But yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so
it's a pretty cool life.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
Like the questions that you're asking lead me to say this. For one, decidedly, had I walked away from the stroke and been wearing high heels running out of the hospital, would this story have the same weight, power? It's extremely unlikely. Extremely. And what a gift. I mean, oh my goodness. I know too much about the suffering of so many within the disability population to not be wide awake to. I get to champion the life of a wheelchair user and showcase, steward to a watching world how to do this well, how to live out loud. And I do not like to be called inspiring, even though, thank you for saying that.
You don't like that word?
But I don't want to be inspiring. I think inspiration is great in a moment, like maybe you're inspired today. However, what I want is not inspiration, but application to your story, to your listener's story, is don't learn the wrong lesson from this story. Learn the right one and apply it to your life. Don't be inspired merely to be inspired for a week, but learn something, a thread that you can carry into your tragedy.
Yeah, I think that while everybody listening obviously hasn't had a brain stroke, I think the connective tissue between your story and everybody else is you talk about this concept of how we're all disabled in a sense.
Right.
And so we have to figure out how to deal with that disability. And so can you explain to me what that concept means?
Oh, for sure. I think that in the disability community right now, which, side note, 20% of the world and 20% of the United States identifies as living with a disability. Just huge. The largest minority group in the world. And who would know that? It's insane. Huge numbers of people living with disabilities. And they're on every list. We are on every list you would never want to be on, from homelessness to suicide to divorce, the highest rates in the nation. Shocking. So what current disability circles are saying, that I am a huge subscriber of, is that everybody who is currently able-bodied is actually just temporarily able-bodied. If you live long enough, chances are you're no longer going to be fully able-bodied. So some of us get there sooner, but most of us will get there. And I think that is a fascinating reframing, that you're temporarily able-bodied. And I'm not fully able-bodied, but we have this deep kinship. And actually, take it a step deeper, I believe every single one of us is living with invisible wheelchairs, and no one would know the junk you're living through because it's largely on the inside, probably. And yet, every single human being has pain and shame and darkness and fear and guilt and a whole gamut of hard stuff on the inside that no one would see. And I'm not even talking about the rampant mental health crisis and all the actual disorders happening inside of us. I mean, being a human being means there is a lot going on in us. And we've all got invisible wheelchairs. I believe, honestly, we are all disabled.
So one of those invisible disability, you referenced the mental health crisis. I was diagnosed with OCD like 6-7 years ago, and that has been very disabling at points.
Yeah, for sure.
But another thing that is kind of related to mental health is how people feel about their own appearance and body image and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
And so you went from, you were a model before this. You said, as a 5'10" blonde with big blue
Right.
eyes, I didn't go unnoticed in most rooms. And so what was it like? In a culture where, and going back to the invisible wheelchair thing, like plastic surgery rates have skyrocketed over the past 25 years. Like, I think 90% of women, I read a statistic about this, experience some level of dissatisfaction about their body. And that's also becoming increasingly common for men. And so what was it like transitioning from your previous reality about your appearance to this one? Because you had talked about that a lot in your books.
For sure. So it has been a journey for sure. So I say all of this 16 years of processing later. But living with a paralyzed face being among the most dramatic appearance changing elements kind of makes you wrestle with what's it all mean? What's it all for? And I think for me, at some point, I woke up to the reality that this body is the only interface I will ever have with existence. That this thing showing up in the world is all that I have to show up in the world with. And it has been the craziest freeing element to the story of I'm on a lot of stages these days, talking with a lot of people and a lot of places with a lot of pictures. And you know what? It's not perfect, but I'm pretty much cool with it. Because somehow the chip got taken out of my beauty standard has to be this. My beauty standards were obliterated when you get a paralyzed face. It changes how you see things. And you realize the tragic obsession with trying to look perfect. What a waste. What a waste of a way to live. You know, I speak to a lot of younger girls these days, and I really hit that point hard that what a tragic way to live your life. Because the reality is, nobody's really looking at you much anyway. They're looking and thinking about themselves. And that is so freeing, and yet not how the brain works. We obsess, and so much of our culture is infatuated with what we look like. And it's so toxic to living out who we are while we're here. Well, we have this one life to live, and we're concerned with how we look? No. How about we're concerned with who we are? That's not changing, because the reality is we're all aging. Our appearance is changing whether we like it or not our whole lives. And we're going to be at that place where we're possibly disabled and we're really old and things are very different in terms of our appearance. But what if we've spent our lives cultivating who we are, our character? What if we cultivate something beyond our appearance? That's really worth living for.
Yeah, I think there's so much wisdom in that, because one of the more disabling parts of the conversation about the appearance is people tend to put their value or their self-worth in the way that they look. And so what would you say is the danger in doing that, and your identity, putting your identity in beauty?
Well, 100%. The danger in it is that it's fading. Whatever you look like right now, you're not going to look like in a few more years. So what a tragic waste to put all your identity in something that is not going to be the same down the road.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that you talked about how, because you had to so immediately accept that this was like going to be your appearance in terms of your face being paralyzed, that almost like it's like you hopped off of that train. And you had talked in your book about how, like, it was, your mother and your grandmother, and there was this lineage of beauty and different things like that. And it's almost like because you were forced into this reality, it kind of freed you from what that whole entire paradigm.
Did.
Yeah.
Having a stroke, having a paralyzed face did free me from the ridiculous obsession with beauty standards. Like it meant I don't have to compete anymore. It was so wonderful. I don't care. And it's not perfect. I do care still. I highlight my hair regularly, and I probably got some really bad roots right now, but I'm getting it highlighted soon. And I want to look good in the world still. But the obsession is not there. And it is glorious that it's not there. It was there. It's not anymore.
Yeah. I think a lot of people to this point, you've said so many incredible and amazing things. And I think the important caveat to it all is, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, but is a tendency to look at your story in like a straight line. And so it's like you just came to this realization, and it's all just been like this. But hard things in your life have kept happening. So can you talk about that in the years that like have followed?
Yeah.
What's happened?
So the stroke was only the beginning, honestly. The neurological issues to date are very significant. They have recently diagnosed me with a neurovascular condition that is so rare. So few people are living with this that they just don't know much about it, other than my brain doesn't work well. And so the initial AVM ruptured. I subsequently had a separate unrelated aneurysm in 2013. In 2017, I had a series of VADs, they call them, vertebral artery dissections, that can cause other strokes. And if I'm honest, I will likely have more of the plethora of brain issues. And so that's all been happening in the last 16 years. And then another just really weird layer is being disabled has meant many horrible falls, some with broken bones. I've broken ribs. I broke my leg severely in 2012. I most recently tore my ACL, MCL, and meniscus and was bedridden again, full-time wheelchair user for many months. And I've had this deep layer of, because of the disability, really bad stuff keeps happening. Because of the brain condition, really bad stuff keeps happening. And then in that same breath, I can hardly tell you that without also saying, but there's actually been some incredibly good stuff that keeps happening. Excuse me. I've gone on to have a second baby. And that was 7.5 years after the stroke. Excuse me. My husband and I founded our nonprofit Hope Heals, and we've written 3 books that are it's very special. My husband and I founded a camp for families with disabilities to come for free and enjoy a vacation at this retreat-like experience. It's glorious. You should come. And, I'm here. I have lived 16 hard years, but in some ways, these have been the very best years, because they're these second chance years of life that, by all accounts, I should not be living. The doctors on call at one of the best hospitals in the nation, all but one would not operate because I was too far gone. They were going to let me die in the waiting room. Subsequently, in looking at brain scans, almost every single doctor who's seen my scans has assumed, well, she definitely died. There's no way that she could have lived, even if they operated. No chance. Doctors from extremely prestigious institutions do not understand how I could be alive right now. They all think, surely she died. And I have to believe that there is purpose in me being here. And that is a word for all of your listeners. Whatever is happening in your life, in your story, however awful it is, you are here. You are in this story. You get to show up to your life right now. And hard stop. this is it. This is our chance at life.
Yeah, you've talked so much about how, like, so you're actively going through all this hard stuff, but there's good, and so you've coined this term, the good hard life. And so, can you talk to me about that and just how good and hard can mutually coexist?
I'm kind of obsessed with it. I have a podcast actually called The Good Hard Story. You may have heard of it. I love The Good Hard Story, The Good Hard Life, because everything in life is both good and hard. Those are not mutually exclusive. They coexist. Everything has both good and hard in it, I believe. And, so much of the deep sadness we feel in life is because we had different expectations for how it was going to be. And yet, what if we don't? What if we live knowing things are good and hard at the very same time? What if we don't only expect it's going to be this one awesome way we thought it was going to be when we were a kid? What if we wake up and recognize that's not how it is going to be? It's never going to be that way, but I can flourish in this. I can flourish in this good, hard story.
Tell me about your 40th birthday.
So my 40th birthday was absolutely incredible in almost every way. So, we flew back to Los Angeles, which is where we lived when I had the stroke. And we had 150 of my very dearest, sweet friends, many of whom had been in the waiting room of the hospital the night I nearly died. And we had this fabulous party. And it was magical. My husband is a really good vocalist. And my birthday wish was that he would sing and be the musical guest at my birthday. And he did. And I made the playlist. And it was awesome. And it was just an incredible night. Sprinkles cupcakes were served, which is my very favorite. And I got to eat them. Hallelujah. And it was awesome. And then fast forward several weeks later, I got the pictures back from the party. And I'm looking at the pictures, and suddenly there's like this moment of deep sadness of, oh my gosh, this was my 40th birthday. I couldn't even stand up for these pictures. I'm like smiling with a crooked smile, and like, this is so sad. And I can remember seeing this one picture. There was a family portrait of us at my 40th birthday. And my sweet husband is standing behind me. I'm in the wheelchair. My sons are next to me. And I can remember thinking, like, if all I knew was that girl celebrating her 40th birthday can't even stand up for the picture, that would be such a tragic story. And yet, I thought in that moment, if they knew more, they would think very differently about this picture. They'd see a husband who stayed when everybody said he'd leave. They'd see another child born after the stroke. They'd see a thriving 16-year-old child. They'd see an intact family celebrating this miracle story and this miracle woman's 40th birthday. And it dawned on me that that's the same picture, that we can see totally different things from looking at the same image. And that is like the story of our lives, that we can look at something, a tragedy, and see it as a tragedy or see it as an opportunity. And that's the magic we each have, is we get to decide how we feel. So much in our lives is decided for us. Stuff happens. And we don't have control. In case your listeners were unaware, we do not have control over a whole lot in this life. But what we do have complete and total control over is how are we going to respond to what happened to us? What are we going to do with it now? How am I going to choose to move forward or not? How am I going to feel about it? That's all decidedly up to me now. I get to narrate my story. No one else does. I get to decide. I get to narrate my story to myself. I get to tell my brain, this is how I feel about my story. And it's incredibly empowering.
Yeah. I kind of want to end with this quote, and this is from your husband, but it's related to what you just said. He wrote in Suffer Strong, he said, one day we will see, one day the arc of our stories will all make perfect sense. One day we will trace the lines of our scars and find them to have fallen in the most pleasant of places to see in them our great inheritance.
So that quote undoes me every time, gives me chills. It's so beautiful. I'm so glad you just quoted that. I love that quote so much. The part about the scars is what really gets me, that one day will all make perfect sense. And there are scars, but the scars are the proof. The scars are the proof that you lived. And then you get to show up, and the boundary lines somehow of your story are exactly where you are supposed to be. It's just so, so powerful.